My name is Dr. Monika Winarnita. I'm from La Trobe University, and I will be chairing this first panel. So the first panel is titled Connectivity, Displacement, and Everyday Life. So the structure of the panel for today is going to be 3 speakers per panel, and we're going to have 20 minutes per presenter, and then we will have 10 minutes of Q&A straight after each presenter. So 20 minutes presentation, 10 minutes question, and then we'll have the next presenter, 20 minutes, 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the first presenter of this panel. It's Professor Supriya Singh, and the title of her paper is Recent Indian Migrants and How They Communicate with Family and Friends. Welcome, Professor Supriya.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here in a crowd where everybody is working on connected things. And it's great to be following Brenda. But just to put you in context, I'm a sociologist of money who then moved into migration. And so I see money as communication, and Facebook and the mobile phone and the internet as subsidiary to a lot of the communication that money has in terms of transnational families. I'm an anthropologist also, so I'm taking you straight to the field. This was a woman in her late 50s with both her sons in Melbourne, and she only had sons. And as I was there, the phone rang. Oh, she called her son to tell him that I am there, from his city, I am there. And then when he called back, she asked, have you eaten? And then she tells me how her daughter-in-law calls her at 8:30 her time, so that temporal boundary, it's 5.5 or 4.5 hours behind in India from Melbourne. And this daughter-in-law sort of works out the time and calls her at 8:30 every morning and to wish her good morning. This is very much the ritual in well-bred, well-functioning joint families, where the daughter-in-law will not only wish her good morning, but maybe touch her feet, yeah? And then the elder son calls at night, and then the younger son calls in between. So she speaks to her sons and daughter-in-law at least 3 times. And the conversation goes to the garden. She tells him, when the mint is growing, could you please pluck it so that it'll grow some more? He says he's got a cough, and she says, will you boil some ginger and honey and drink? And I'm sitting there absolutely envious, because I've been a multiple migrant. And I not only did not have these conversations with my mother in India, but I don't have these conversations with my son in Melbourne 3 times a day. So one of the things that I recognized is that a lot of the family members in India that I interviewed were all retired. Grandmothers would be showing you pictures of their grandchildren on their mobile phone and talking to their grandchildren at all moments of the day. Then the second one, I was in a regional city also. I was in a lot of regional cities, small towns, and urban villages, because the transnational families that I met in India had recent migrant children. Most of the migrants like me who came in the 1980s in Australia, our parents are dead. And so it's the recent migrants that have those full transnational families that were willing to be interviewed. And this is a business family that's been 3 generations in business. And they have this new house. It is a cavernous house, huge living room. And the family, 2 sons out of the 3 are in this city. So the family gets together in this large living room. And then they tell you how they Skype in the living room. And Lakshman is the one who is in Melbourne. And the father still is very able to dictate the rhythms of the lives of the children, whether they are in the city that he lives in or in Melbourne. And he says how, they discuss everything, everything. And this guy, when he came, he was supported wholly by his father because the father could afford it and felt it was his responsibility. And when he came, he looked at every other recent migrant, Indian migrant working, and he got a job as a security guard. So he called his father that I've got this job as a security guard. The father was absolutely livid. He said, don't you know what kind of a family you come from? How dare you do something like this? So he resigned the very next day. But what was very interesting about this family is that they seemed to tell each other everything. A lot of migrants don't tell each other everything. I interviewed one migrant who was working in a factory, and he hadn't told his parents that he was working in a factory because he came from a middle-class professional family, and he said it would be terrible. In India, I used to get up at 5 o'clock to go and play tennis, and now I get up at 5 o'clock to go to the factory. So this is what, Loretta Baldassar talks about as open secrets. Maybe there's some things you understand but do not ask. But in Lakshman's family, they talk about, what kind of dress you're going to wear to that party, what kind of list you have for the dinner you're going to have, what's the menu. And it's absolutely amazing, this kind of connectedness for any kind of family, leave alone a transnational family. This is another young man, very enterprising young man, again from a regional city. He had been here, he's just 25, come for his education after school, already had 3 businesses, had bought a piece of land so that he could build a house for himself and his mother and father and his mother's sister who had brought him up. The parents were still in the 50s, but he had this kind of agency. I asked him, I said, what is making you think that your parents will uproot themselves and come here? He says, well, if they don't come, I will leave. So as we were discussing, the recent migrants have come within a framework of temporariness, but they have a lot of mobility and a lot of agency. They come here thinking that they will settle if the opportunity arises and if it suits them. If it doesn't suit them, they will return, go somewhere else, and maybe return again. So this is what this guy did. And he went at least once a year to visit his family. He spoke to them every day. And what I was amazed about is that when I met with his family, they were telling me nearly in the same words about his life the way he told me in the interview. Nearly ditto the same words. There's a tragedy here in that he died when he was 25 and visiting India. And his father then, when I went for a condolence call, his father held on and said, now what do I do? He used to call me every single day and say, Papa Yar. Yar means friend or mate. What do I do about this problem? And we would discuss nearly everything together. But they were absolutely connected worlds. And when they came to meet with his friends over here and stayed with them to wind up the businesses, there was nothing the friends could tell them that they didn't already know. This is the way money flows among the recent migrants. And the reason I'm making a point of this is that it flows 2 ways. The reason it flows 2 ways is one of the differences of the recent migrants is that they have been the first Indian migrant group that has had to pay for the opportunity to migrate. And the money it's a very much a family decision. they definitely have a license to leave. It's not an individual decision for personal mobility, as happened with the earlier migrants. Usually the male chose to come to Australia to advance his professional career. But in this case, the student is coming both for his welfare and the family's welfare. So basically, the family emptied out its whole retirement buffer and took on greater liabilities to send the son. But what happens with the kind of communication that is possible, this mobile, Skype, every day, the visits that are possible, is that some of the things that remain unsaid get heard. And so when he told his mother that when he goes to work in a factory, he sometimes can't get, it's after the last train. So he stays with a friend, and it's quite late. So he just drinks a glass of hot milk and goes to sleep. And the mother immediately told the father, we have to send him money for a second-hand car. Now, you didn't ask, but you got. So the same thing kinds of happens as the children realize what their parents need. Like Lakshman, when the family was building a new house, insisted that the fridge come from him. So the mother immediately pointed out, look, that's his fridge. And the kinds of gifts that the children take home. I went to one family's place, and they said, look, he presented his mother with this mobile phone. And sometimes it is with a lot of tears in their eyes, because they understand how hard this child has had to work to produce the money for the gift. When Dharma presented his father with a new car, the father immediately said, are you into something shifty? Where did you get this money from? Well, he knew his father, so he showed his pay slips. He said, I've been working 3 jobs. So money and the ICTs, as it were, money, language, these are the 2 ways of communicating care. And my study of money, migration, and family has focused on the care side of it. I have become very aware that money and language also communicate coercion and violence, but you didn't get so many cases of that. So what is happening is that it is not just a connected transnational family that I saw, but I saw the connectedness of families. This is not just doing family, but it is displaying family. And this whole idea, and a lot of people, and some of them are in this room, that idea of co-presence and the virtual and the physical coming together and replicating the routines of family life. Now, these communication patterns and the connectedness of transnational families become something to remark upon when you compare and contrast it with what was the early migrant experience, the migrants who came from India in the 1970s to the mid-1990s. Doesn't mean that they did not have a sense of family, but the everydayness of the transnational family was missing. Some of you may not ever have written an air letter form, but that was the main way of communicating. And it became very difficult if there were language differences. Like, I am fluent in English, but speak Punjabi well. My mother was fluent in Punjabi and spoke English, but not as well. So we had this very interesting thing. And a phone was something to dread. You kind of thought, oh my God, somebody has fallen ill or died. And telegrams were still sent. My mother, and even when we did, phones were affordable, the phones were not necessarily there in the home country. My mother only got a landline in her small town in 1995. And before that, it was a little bit, I think, like Brenda was saying, before, you had to organize to go. There was a doctor downstairs, and we had to work out a time, my sister in New York and me in Melbourne, as my mother would be at that doctor's place at a certain time, and then we would call her. The very interesting theoretical aspect of this everyday synchronous kind of conversation is that as the communication with the new technologies becomes frequent and routine, it changes the meanings and the flows of money. So early migrants, the money went one way from the migrant to their family members in India. The communication went one way, the visits went one way. But what happens with the recent migrants is that both the communication and the money go two ways. So changing the flow of communication actually changes the flow of money and the meanings. This is just to give you a notion of where this data is coming from. Fortunate enough to have done it over a number of years and different phases of migration. In the context of this symposium, Facebook is absent in their stories of communication with family. And I think it's very much an example of polymedia, where the choices of the channels for communicating with family, with close family, is something that is oral, something that is visual, something that does not require too much media literacy, and something that does not require literacy in English. Because a lot of these recent migrants come from small towns and villages, and you're not going to get that kind of media there. But for cousins and friends, it is used. And I'm not concentrating on the friends because some of the recent migrants absolutely live on Facebook as far as their friends are concerned. And they'll tell you, you know, they're 536 friends. But a lot of this research was done in 2010 to 12, and Orkut in India was still the preferred social media presence. Just to tell you that the situation has changed for both the early migrants and the recent migrants right now. Anita, this is a woman who came in 1973. She was the one who was telling me with absolute horror how expensive the phone calls were. She told me they cost 25 rupees for 3 minutes. Not totally true because I checked, but they cost 750 for the first minute and 2 something for the other 2 minutes. But now you see exactly the kind of dispersal of family. Those early migrants have become transnational families, not just in that their natal families are overseas, but their children are overseas and settled overseas. So her daughter and grandson are in the US. And she has become absolutely adept at the webcam. But she had this lovely story where she says how her grandson rings her up at 1:30 a.m. There's no temporal boundary there. And says, Amma, I'm having ice cream for breakfast. So she sees him every day. And now she talks to her sisters who are also in the United States. And she says she talks with them together for hours. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Nick Herriman. I'm from La Trobe University. I really enjoyed the paper. A lot of my research works on tensions within families and in sort of smaller sphere between friends, neighbours and families and so on. And you said that you didn't want to deal with this in the presentation, but of course that really piqued my interest. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate. I mean, it was really nice to see this kind of positive, kind of communal and bond-making aspect of these media, but I'm also interested in the flip side that you were mentioning.
Okay. Just because you're able to communicate does not mean that you're going to necessarily have a great relationship. The new technologies don't make for great relationships. They can oil the relationship if it happens. So I think Brenda mentioned a little bit that you can relativize your communication, and depends very much on communication patterns. I had one of the early migrants in my study who is a lawyer now, and her communication always went through the father. The father writing in a letter form, everybody is well here, I hope you are well, we are well, love, yeah? That kind of thing. And then the father fell ill. And there had been no habit of communicating with the siblings or the mother. All her communication was with the father. And actually, she didn't find out that he was so ill. She went to India, but she reached the day after he died. And she was just heartbroken. And she was actually very angry with her family that, how come you didn't tell me? And they said, well, you should have known. And she is having very big problems now in terms of connecting with the family, and she is making a lot of effort. With her younger brother, she says she's on email, and with her mother on the phone, and she goes every year to visit her mother. So the fact that you have these communication technologies can heighten what you already have in terms of relationship. I mean, the second generation, for instance, when I ask them how often do you talk to your family in India, when they go to visit and they come back, they are on Facebook with their cousins. But often there is such a distance between them. They haven't grown up together. And they say after a little while it just fades. But then it may pick up again at different stages of your life. One of them said, now that I have a young child and my cousin has a young child in the US, we seem to have a lot to talk about. But otherwise we do. So I think the focus is more on communication and relationships in the family rather than in the affordances of technology.
Thank you, Supriya. I always really enjoy hearing about your work. I wonder if I could ask you to extend on that a little bit further. And were there any examples in the families you spoke to of particular people taking responsibility for introducing other family members to different technology? Like, was there any discussion about, oh, you must get this phone plan, or you must get this type of social media or telephone or whatever? Was there any of that sort of exchange within the family network?
Particularly with Skype. One of the persons I introduced, Charandeep, the one whose mother sent him the money for the car. Now, they didn't have the internet at home. And he very much wanted to Skype and put an internet phone. And I know that when he went back, he spent many frustrating days trying to get the technician to come and do it so that he could show his father how to use the internet and use the computer. So things like that. Otherwise, there are sometimes people within the transnational family with different kinds of expertise. But very often, the migrants will make sure that there is an internet phone in the house.
Hi, I'm Maria Platt. Thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it. I was just also interested to understand a little bit more. You talked, as you kind of highlighted, more about the kind of harmonious aspects of familial relations, and I was also interested in the role of money in places where conflict occurred and how money could be used in more perhaps perverse ways within families to, and how that also intersects with your focus on communication, transnational communication.
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. This is very much in the context of the Global South families, where money is a medium of communication and care. this is within the wider context that money is a preferred gift. Now, some of you who are from China or from India, it's not going to be new to you that at festivals you get fresh sort of new money notes, all nicely packaged in a red ang pao packet or in a tasseled shagun envelope, yeah? And money is not just a gift because you haven't thought of anything better. Money is the preferred gift. I'll give you an example. My sister and I, who've been out of India for a long time, and a kind of very close aunt's grandson was getting married. And we started thinking, what can we give her that will show the closeness of her relationship with our mother? And we were thinking of a carved dressing table. And my cousin said, don't be idiotic, just give her shagun, money. And so we had to give the right amount of money to reflect the closeness of the relationship. So money is, within that context, a medium of care. But it's also a dynamic of family relationships that money goes between generations, not just like in the Anglo-Celtic world from the parents down to the children, but it goes back from the children to the parents as a way of showing filial care. So money becomes very loaded with the symbolism of family and care. Where the relationship falters, and if you have, I had a case in my study, and it's in the literature quite a lot, in the literature meaning in French literature, English literature, where the relationship has broken and there is no communication between the son and the mother, sending money to the mother means nothing at all. So it's only where the communication is great that sending money to the parents becomes inflated with care. But where the communication is patchy, the siblings will say, it's easy for her to send money, she earns it in dollars. We are the ones who are doing all the work. So the money you send is, the dollar you send is not the dollar received. But like this person who said, look, he bought the mobile, and we know how much work he has to do. That mobile becomes absolutely inflated with care. So it is the relationship and the communication between people that gives the meaning to this communication and that gives the meaning to the money.
Last question. Do we have any last question? We move on to the second presenter.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.